The first time the basement light died, Marina felt the house let go of her in a gentle way, the rectangular glow shrinking across the concrete and folding up into the bulb like a breath drawn and held. And she turned from the breaker panel with the simple satisfaction of having fixed something on her own, without needing to ask a neighbor or wait for morning. One hand trailing the rough wooden railing, thoughts already drifting toward tea and a blanket and a text to her sister about how the storm rattled the siding like an impatient guest. The second time, the light didn't die. It returned, a soft click and a warm wash that filled the stairwell again. And she watched the plastic toggle at the top of the stairs ease down in a slow, patient motion that could not belong to gravity, the kind of movement you only see when a fingertip guides it, gentle enough to keep the sound small, deliberate enough to announce that someone had been standing close enough to brush her shoulder if they wanted. She froze with one foot on the step and her other planted on cool concrete, the position weirdly intimate, like the house had put her in a pose for a photo, and her skin prickled beneath her sweater in that fine, electric way that means the body has decided the world is suddenly too close. And for several seconds he did nothing but listen, because listening sometimes changes things, and the basement had a soundtrack of its own, furnace metal ticking as it cooled, laundry machine drums settling with a tone like someone touching a wineglass rim, the faint watery hum that belongs to houses older than their owners, the air down there smelling like damp cardboard and old soil, a smell that comes with places you don't visit at night. Marina reached up and pressed the top switch with her thumb until it stopped, feeling the cheap plastic warm to her skin, and the light went out again obediently, the bulb's filament dying into a quiet that felt a little smug, as if the house had yielded only because she insisted with touch. And she took the next step, then another, cautious in a way that made the stair creak with an exaggerated honesty. The light came back, quicker this time, with a confident click, splashing brightness into the stairwell, so fast the shadows jumped like startled cats, and the toggle at the top didn't creep this time. It snapped down on its own, in a motion so clean it felt like muscle memory, and her heart gave a hot thud that left a metallic taste at the back of her tongue. The penny taste fear brings, and he stared at the switch's shiny face and noticed the smallest reflection in it, a smudged ellipse of her own cheek warped in the gloss that made the plastic look wet. Marina called out, the word thinner than she wanted, hello, addressed to nobody in particular, and to the whole house in general, and nothing answered except the house's patience, which is worse than noise because patience means the thing beneath the noise has time and confidence. She thought of wiring diagrams she had never learned and of three-way switches and of the way old houses sometimes insist on their quirks until you accept them, but the motion she had seen was not a quirk, not a bounce, not a mechanical defect. It was a decision, somebody's finger traveling through a small arc slowly enough to be seen and then faster when she tried to leave, and he turned down again, stepping back into the rectangle of light and pressing the switch at the bottom of the stairs, the twin to the one above, feeling for resistance. And when she pushed it up, the bulb did go out, darkness flattening the basement into a vague geometry of softer shapes. And for a handful of seconds the quiet was true, the kind of silence that let shoulders drop. Then something breathed. It didn't belong to the furnace or the ducts. It wasn't the soft sigh of air moving through a vent. It was a human rhythm placed in the room without a body to claim it. A slow inhale that did not line up with her own breath, and a longer exhale that arrived on its own schedule. A presence timing itself to not overlap so she would notice it. Marina let her hand hover over the bottom switch, not touching, and the breath paused like a person waiting to see if you'll speak, then resumed, and the light returned abruptly, the bulb making a small metal pop inside as you'd expect when it wakes, except the switch did not move under her fingers, and the top toggle jolted down instead with a visible twitch, the house choosing the upper decision for her. He pictured herself running through the kitchen. Front door, neighbor with a porch light. But the image had a peculiar wrongness, the front door opening into a hallway where the deadbolt had slid itself closed. Already stupid thought, she told herself, cruel joke her brain plays when adrenaline is high. She climbed 3 steps and felt heat seep into her fingertips as the top switch brushed her knuckles. And the warmth made no sense because the plastic should have been cool, and she pulled her hand away quickly, as if she had touched somebody's skin by accident, and stood on the landing, trying again to bully logic into the room. The smoke detector blinked its patient green every 30 seconds. The framed photo of a lake at sunset sat harmlessly crooked like always. The hallway rug edge flipped slightly, All inventory, all ordinary, and none of it accounted for the impression that the house had shifted closer to her face. Marina leaned to the doorway and called, more steady now, "Who is there?" And the answer wasn't a voice but the sound of the laundry pile shifting. A small settling like fabric around a weight adjusting itself, and he swallowed hard enough to feel it scrape. Her phone on the kitchen counter buzzed with a text from a friend. Normal words, checking on the storm. Ordinary life, trying to walk into the scene. And in that same beat, the basement light clicked off without her touch, and then on, off and on, twice, the toggles above and below thudding in a synchronized pattern that formed an odd rhythm like someone playing with the idea of Morse code without knowing its rules. Marina stepped down one stair against the urge to flee because not seeing would be worse than seeing, and the breath came again, closer. Precisely placed at the bottom of the stairs, like someone waiting at a polite distance, and the top switch eased itself down in a tiny incremental movement like a finger resting on it grew heavier in thoughtful increments. For a moment, he decided to leave and reached for the kitchen light instead, hitting the wall plate with the small confidence that brightness gives. And the kitchen stayed dark even as the switch toggled under her thumb in a satisfying click. And the realization that the house's decisions were no longer limited to the basement arrived with a cold flush that started at her wrists and climbed. She pressed it again, and on the third press, the ceiling light did come on with an almost apologetic glow, a soft white that made the hallway shadows crisp. And in that crispness, a detail appeared on the upstairs wall where the top switch sat, a thin crescent of fresh scuff marks around the toggle, a fingernail's repetitive trace, new enough to be visible against the paint. She turned toward the front door, because the door is a rule older than electricity, and her hand settled on the deadbolt while she looked through the peephole and saw only the storm's washed black and the flat reflection of her own eye distorted by curved glass. And behind her, downstairs, a voice formed for the first time, almost a voice, breath wrapped around a syllable, saying the name, Marina, in a careful way that sounded like the word had been practiced elsewhere and brought into the house to try. And both switches flipped down together in a single smooth motion. She did not touch, a mirrored gesture like two hands performing. The lights died, then came back to bright, a flood so clean it made dust motes look like tiny watchers suspended by strings. Marina turned the deadbolt gently, meaning it only as a test, and the metal slid with alarming eagerness, locking in a way that felt like a promise she hadn't made, and the breath below timed itself to her own now, aligning its inhale to hers as if borrowing pace, then yanked the switch up, then down, finding the control satisfying, petty, human, and the house ignored it, the bulb holding steady in defiance, a silent argument she could not win by pressing. The last sound came quietly, a low dragging from within the wall beside the top switch, a sound too localized for pipes, tracing a path behind paint toward the stairs, and Marina stood with her palm flat on the smooth plate, feeling heat bloom under it from the other side like a hand pressed back in greeting. And the light finally went out without a click at all, no mechanical honesty, just dark, followed by the gentle press of the deadbolt turning itself once more, moving from locked to something else, while the breath waited, perfectly synchronized, a stranger's patience, learning her rhythm, one quiet inch at a time.
Michael laid awake in the thin grey hour when even familiar rooms feel slightly wrong, listening to the house stretch and settle, when a whisper slipped out of the metal vent above his dresser and shaped itself around his name with a careful patience that did not belong to wind or pipes, and he went very still, as if stillness could convince the sound that it had chosen the wrong person, as if the house would apologize and give the syllables back to the night. He stared at the vent without blinking, noting how the slats caught a smear of streetlight like pale ribs, and he told himself he had misheard, that it was air folding strangely in the ductwork and nothing more. Then a new noise followed, heavy and slow, the grim friction of weight sliding over rough surfaces, not the darting scramble of an animal, but the human rhythm of elbows pulling a body forward with deliberate pauses to listen, and his skin rose with pinpricks along his arms under the blanket, a prickling that traveled to the back of his neck and sat there, waiting to see what he would do. He considered pretending, turning his face to the pillow and pushing himself into the small, harmless narrative of insomnia and an old house, but the crawl space under his bedroom had always held a question. A dark, square hatch in the hall closet leading down to dirt and pipes and forgotten things. And he knew if he didn't move now, he would feel a worse kind of fear when the whisper came again, because there is a difference between being surprised by a voice and waiting for it to repeat you back. The clock put a red 2:38 on the wall, and the hour felt thin enough to cut, and he sat up, slow enough to keep the mattress quiet, and whispered a small "hello" that caught at the edge of his throat and didn't sound like courage. The dragging paused as if the sound beneath had ears, and the whisper returned with a careful exactitude. "Michael." Each letter unwound softly, arriving like someone inching fingers through the slats to touch his name, and his mouth went dry with that metallic taste fear gives, a copper coin on the tongue, and he swung his legs to the cold floor and stood, the quick shock of temperature at his bare feet anchoring him in the room without relieving him of any dread. He crossed the hall to the closet with the low hatch that had waited for him since he moved in, a neat wooden square with 2 latches that always looked like little eyes in dim light, and he knelt and put his fingertips on the warm metal, surprised by the warmth because the closet was colder than the bedroom, and the latches should have felt like night. He loosened one latch and then the other, each tiny click seeming loud enough to turn the house into a listening place, and gently lifted the hatch just enough to invite the crawlspace's air into the hallway, an air that smelled like damp soil and old insulation, the breath of places people avoid, and his stomach pitched as the darkness looked not empty but intentional, uneven dirt in shallow troughs, worn as if someone had pulled themselves along the perimeter repeatedly, paths made by insistence rather than travel. He kept the hatch tilted, not opening it fully, unwilling to see too much while needing to see enough, and when his eyes adjusted he noticed a small point of dull reflection just inside, not light, but a glimmer from metal or wet wood, catching what little glow existed. And then the voice rose from that same black plane, less shy now, his name pronounced with a more assured rhythm, like a student pleased with his own repetition. "Who are you?" Michael asked softly, a question he didn't truly want answered, and the reply came as a whisper, shaped like a smile, wrong only in how calm it was, and then a scrape sounded where the hatch meets its frame, a fingertip testing the wood, an up pressure that did not lift the panel but announced presence, and he felt something push in the center of his chest. That pressure fear places there when doors don't behave the way doors are supposed to behave. So he lowered the hatch and slid a latch clumsily, then the other with an effort that made him realize his hands had gone cold. For a few seconds there was a relief, a small vacuum of quiet that felt like safety, and then a tapping started underneath in a circle, tracing the edges as if measuring, and the whisper of his name drifted out again from the vent in the bedroom, easily like breath through a reed. He backed up and turned toward the front door, thinking of light and neighbors and police and someone else's voice to drown this one. And his phone lit on the nightstand with a message from a friend who sometimes worked nights, a casual, "You up?" the normality of which hurt a little, and he wrote back quickly, told them he thought someone was in the crawl space, that the vent had said his name, that the hatch felt pressed from below, and the reply came fast enough to feel human and present, telling him to stay upstairs, to call, that they were stepping onto their porch now to check, to keep the doors locked and lights on. His kitchen light clicked on as if it had heard the advice itself, a bright square spreading across tile. And he didn't remember hitting the switch, but he was grateful for the flood of illumination even as it sharpened every shadow into something considered and placed. The house went quiet the way houses do when they want you to feel watched. And in that quiet the vent whispered his name once more, softer than before, an exhale with syllables. Then the dragging reversed with a patience that felt practiced, moving away from the bedroom, moving into the deeper under the house where the foundation makes a corner you can never reach without crawling into it. Michael stepped to the front door and put his eye to the peephole, expecting the piece of comfort he needed, a silhouette of a neighbor, a raised hand, a mouth forming his name in the honest way voices do, and he saw nothing, only the porch lamp's dead eye and the shape of his own street in a dark smear. He reached for the deadbolt and froze because the wall behind him knocked 3 times from inside the crawl space. 3 dull human thuds from a place where there should only be earth, each knock spaced with a pause like someone deciding whether to continue. And his phone vibrated in his hand again, the friend writing that they were at his door, knocking, asking why he wasn't answering. And the contradiction tore at his head. The entire house split between what the phone said and what his ears heard, and he needed very badly to choose which version of the night was true. But the vent made that choice for him, breathing his name one more time, with an ease that felt like relief, and the cold air pushed up through metal and slid along the floor to touch his ankles like chilled hands, patient and knowing. The kind of cold that arrives when someone under a house is waiting for a mouth to lean closer to metal and listen for a reply that feels like an invitation.
Carol stared at the text glowing on her screen, and her breath stalled in a way that made her shoulders feel heavy, because the words had arrived with a photo from an angle she had never stood in. A thin sliver of view through a crack that framed her living room, in a wedge of lamplight and couch fabric, the shot slightly warped like it had been pressed through plaster, and the lamp's filament looked brutally bright in that narrow barrel of focus, in a way a normal photo never does. She stood a few feet from the couch and turned in a slow circle, the room unchanged, a blanket draped exactly where she had left it, the remote at a slight angle on the coffee table, the plant with its new leaves still wet from the water she had given it at dinner. And the angle in the photo simply didn't exist from any human position in the space, which meant it had to exist from a place the room hid. Her skin prickled with that small electric awareness that shakes loose when danger hasn't shown itself but has sent a polite RSVP, and she told herself that this had to be a prank, a neighbor messing with her, a wrong number. A photo grabbed off her social media, even though she knew she had never posted this exact combination of lamp glow and blanket fold and remote angle. The message sat below the previous one, without a typing bubble, without any little sign of movement, and when she lifted the volume on the TV with the habit of wanting noise to fill awkwardness, the sound felt wrong in the room, too cheerful, too familiar, so she lowered it again until it was a whisper under everything else. Until the refrigerator hum and the faint tick of the baseboard heater arranged themselves into the house's sleepy soundtrack. She walked closer to the wall by the bookshelf where the photo's crack might be if the angle meant anything, and she pressed her ear lightly to the painted plaster, feeling cold that came from inside rather than from the room. A deep cold that older houses keep in their ribs and don't always share with the people living in them. Her phone buzzed softly in her palm, and she flinched at the intimacy of the sound, then forced her eyes down to read the new line, "Don't scream." The words arrived without punctuation, which somehow made them feel more direct, and the following image showed the same living room from the same slit, except her own shoulder was now in the corner of the frame, a dark curve of fabric and skin where it met the wall, proving the photographer hadn't used some old picture but was actively present somewhere behind what she was touching. Carol pulled her ear away with a slow care, because movement felt like communication now, and her thumb hovered over the emergency call icon long enough to make her feel like she had already committed a crime just by wanting help. She texted back instead, her fingers shaking so obviously that she had to retype twice to keep "Who are you" from becoming nonsense, and the reply came after 3 seconds that felt engineered, "Don't call. You'll make me move." The sentence landed heavy. In that way threats do that, pretend they are polite, and her mind tried to map the inside of her walls the way you piece together a puzzle from memory, the studs and cavities, the narrow chase where a water pipe climbs, the holes cut decades ago for wiring that someone later covered with mud and paint. None of those had space for a person, yet the photo had space for an eye, and an eye is a person whether or not the rest of the body fits. She stepped back from the wall and moved toward the hallway where the light died into cooler shadow, because a layer of distance felt like logic, felt like sanity, and in the shadow the house's quiet tightened around her head as if the drywall itself had leaned in to listen, and she tried the front door deadbolt with the idea that going outside would convert this into something public, where paranoia gets punished and help has a shape, and the lock turned too smoothly. The door eased open to the porch, where the air was wet and cold and the street black and steeped with the kind of darkness that makes porches feel like stages. Carol stood with the door half open, and her phone did a small buzz again. A photo of the hallway shone through a crack higher than before, angled down at the crown of her head, showing the door in its half-open dishonesty, proving that the photographer could see both her choice and her hesitation. She closed the door with a care that felt like respecting someone else's space, then turned all the lights on with the panic logic that says brightness has meaning, and the living room spread into sharpness. Every shadow defined, the corners suddenly precise in a way they never are when you're relaxed, and her stomach twitched with the nerves that felt like a hand rearranging her organs gently to remind her she was soft. She texted again, pushing past pride because pride is useless when walls participate. The words small and clean, "What do you want?" And the reply took longer, enough time for her to realize she had started counting seconds in her head, and it said, "To stay. You make good noises." The language sat wrong against her bones, and she moved into the kitchen because kitchens convinced you that boxes and drawers and safety tricks exist. And the mess of utensils felt like a catalog of ways to pretend courage. Yet all the steel and wood in the drawers was a costume without a person inside, and the cold creeped into her forearms as if the house had decided to push its crawl space, weather through the studs. Carol stared at the wall near the fridge where she remembered her neighbor pointing at a soft patch last summer, saying the plaster wasn't original and someone at some point had patched something, and she reached to tap knuckles against it, expecting the dull thud of insulation, but it sounded hollow, and her knuckles came away chalky with paint dust, a fine powder that felt like skin's enemy. The next photo arrived without text, a slit view of the kitchen, the corner of the fridge, a slice of her elbow as she touched the wall, and in the dark region of the slit, the glint of moisture like someone's eye hadn't blinked in a while and decided not to start now. And she felt the peculiar shame that comes when you realize you are starring in another person's stage without permission. Carol lifted the phone halfway to her ear like she might call anyway if her thumb could forget fear, and the screen lit again, plain words that resembled house rules. "If you call, I go up." And the next photo was angled higher, a demonstration, the focus catching the line where wall meets ceiling, the crown molding painted over 3 times in her years here, a clean edge that now felt like a horizon, and her heart moved in her chest as if trying to climb that edge on its own to leave. She texted her neighbor quietly, "A careful are you awake?" and stared at the typing bubbles that didn't appear, and the refrigerator hummed steady and reliable, masking the subtle skitter she thought she heard inside the wall where her palm had been, a tiny sound that didn't travel fast, not mice or roaches, but a slow repositioning like someone dragging a sleeve against rough wood. She wanted to shout, the instinct loud in the throat, but the text's command sat inside her sentence, as if she had swallowed it, and in the place of a shout came a whisper she didn't intend, her own name, Carol, spoken into a room that had learned new rules, and the wall answered with more silence, good silence, until the phone vibrated gently and made her fear drop through her like a stone. "You don't need the door. I like this room better." The words sounded as if they had practiced living beside her for a while, and she walked to the hallway again because the door is the old trick people still trust, and the door sat in its frame pretending to be authority, and her hand went to the deadbolt and stayed there as if touch alone could set terms, and the phone buzzed with the last image, the crack narrower, higher, the angle looking down over the hallway. In the tiny depth of the slit she finally saw a piece of rough skin, the edge of a finger pad pressing against plaster, a dull crescent of dirt in the pattern of a nail, proof not just of presence but of patience. And she lifted the bolt without meaning to, as if responding to manners, expecting to see the neighbor, expecting a shape with a face, and the house stayed quiet except for the faint scuff behind the wall where the hallway turns, a slow movement toward a corner nobody ever looks at, and the text arrived as the bolt slid home again with a small click that sounded too loud. "Don't worry, you won't see me. I'm better when you don't."